It starts with a tiny mistake that is only 4 letters long, a small insertion in a gene called hexa. 4 DNA letters added where they do not belong, creating a sequence scientists call 1278 INS TATC. The name sounds cold, but what it does to a family is brutal. It breaks an enzyme that babies need to clean their cells, and without that enzyme, a fatty substance builds up in the brain. This buildup damages nerve cells until the infant can no longer do the things babies are meant to do. This is infantile Tay-Sachs disease, and it is fatal. Here's the twist that makes people sit up straight. This same 4-letter insertion shows up again and again in 2 groups that most people would never place in the same sentence: Cajuns in southwest Louisiana and Ashkenazi Jews. If you believe these groups are linked by a hidden mix of ancestry, you can walk away with the wrong story. The records tell a sharper one. The mutation rises in both groups because of founder effects, meaning small starting populations, and isolation can make rare variants grow common without any direct mixing. This mutation behaves like a famous traveler in a family saga. It moves through bloodlines in silence. It is ancient enough to exist in European roots. Then it gets amplified in 2 separate worlds. One world is the Ashkenazi Jewish history of bottlenecks. The other is the Cajun history that begins with Acadians, who were expelled from Nova Scotia between 1755 and 1764 and ended up in Louisiana. These are not vague stories. Your data ties Cajun carriers to pedigrees that trace back to a single French ancestral couple, present since the population's 18th century founding. That is the kind of detail that changes the timeline in your head. It is not everywhere. It is a tight chain. Before the mutation becomes a crisis, it hides inside people who look healthy. That is what carrier means here. A carrier can pass the variant on without being sick, allowing it to spread quietly. In the Cajun families studied in southwest Louisiana, the pattern became hard to ignore. In one report, 11 of 12 Tay-Sachs disease alleles from 6 families carried this same 4-base insertion. That is not a sprinkle, that is a stamp. It is the same genetic typo showing up again and again, as if the story keeps circling the same page. The Acadian founders did not set out to build a genetic hotspot. They were pushed. Between 1755 and 1764, Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia. That event breaks families in a way that is easy to say and hard to picture. Home is not just land. Home is neighbors who know your name and a cousin who can help when a child is sick. When that network is cut, a population can shrink fast. A small group survives, then rebuilds. That is a founder effect in human terms. The starting group is small, so whatever rare variants they carry can become common later, not because the variant is better, but because the deck is reshuffled with fewer cards. The Acadian founders who reached Louisiana came from earlier roots in western France, including places like Poitou, where Tay-Sachs alleles circulated. That detail matters because it places the mutation before Louisiana. It did not appear in a swamp like a new monster. It arrived with people. Then the bayous did what isolated places often do. They create tight circles. Bottlenecks, meaning sharp drops in population size, can happen from hardship, disease, storms, or simple distance from the outside world. When communities stay more isolated, a rare variant can grow common because the same families intermarry over time. No villain is needed, no secret society, just geography and a small starting base. Picture what that means inside a community. You can have a carrier rate that reaches 1 in 10 in Cajun hotspots. 1 in 10 is not a rare whisper. It is the size of a crowded dinner table where someone is almost always touched by it, even if nobody knows it. Your data says targeted screening programs formed because of these carrier rates and the concentration. Then comes another twist that raises the stakes. The mutation's wide distribution means testing has to go beyond families who already know they have risk. If you only test the families with a history, you miss carriers who never had a known case. That is how silence keeps winning. He lifts the lid of a boiling pot and the smell fills the room before the cameras even settle. He laughs, wipes his hands on his apron, and starts telling a story that sounds like a joke until it isn't. He talks about people who were told to leave their homes with guns pointed at them. He talks about families torn apart and scattered like seeds. Then he stirs the pot and says, "And that's why we cook like this." If you think Cajun food is just spice and swagger, you are missing the real engine. You are missing an ancestry built on expulsion, loss, and survival by any means available. Justin Wilson was famous for making people smile, but the smile sat on top of something much older and much darker. If you don't know that story, you only see the performance. If you do know it, every laugh carries weight. Before he was famous, before television made him a household name, Justin Wilson was just a boy in Louisiana listening to older voices. He grew up in a world where history wasn't kept in books on a shelf. It was kept in kitchens. It lived in recipes repeated without measuring cups and in accents that refused to flatten out. It lived in a deep sense that this place was earned, not given. To understand why that mattered, you have to meet his ancestors as people, not as labels. In 1755, British forces decided the Acadians of Nova Scotia could not be trusted. The choice offered to the Acadians was not real: swear loyalty or be removed. The consequence was le grand dérangement. About 11,500 to 12,000 people were deported. In Grand Pré, about 1,600 people were crammed into a church, trapped and waiting. Over 60 overcrowded ships carried men, women, and children to scattered British colonies. The crossings were deadly. Over 1,600 people died at sea from disease and starvation. Some did not make it onto ships. About 3,000 to 5,000 Acadians escaped or survived outside the main deportations. By about 1765, survivors reached Louisiana's bayous. Once there, the problem changed but did not disappear. Louisiana offered isolation, not comfort. These families arrived poor and traumatized. About 50 to 100 related French founder families formed the base of what would become Cajun communities. Their choice was to stick together. They married within the group and shared work. The consequence of that isolation was double-edged. On one side, culture survived, language, food, and customs stayed intact. On the other side, genetics tightened. Endogamy, meaning marriage within a small group, created bottlenecks. Rare genetic traits that would normally fade could become common. Over time, recessive disorders rose to noticeable levels. None of this was chosen with intent. It was the result of survival decisions made under pressure. Justin Wilson did not talk about carrier rates on television. He talked about gumbo, but gumbo itself tells the story. It is built from what you have when you have lost everything else. A man tastes a pot of simmering food, pauses, then pushes it away. He doesn't shout, "Bam!" He doesn't smile. He asks one quiet question instead. What's missing? This is Emeril Lagasse before the catchphrases took over. The penalty, if you don't stay with this story, is simple. You'll think Cajun culture is just spice and music. The reward is heavier. You'll see why doctors in Louisiana screen babies at birth for rare genetic disorders most Americans only see in textbooks. You'll see how a small group of families, about 50 French families, forced out in 1735, created a genetic echo so strong it still shapes medicine today. Emeril's world was built by people who survived by staying close, marrying close, and paying a price for it generations later. Before Emeril was famous, He was a kid learning rules that weren't written down. He learned that food is memory and proof you belong. Emerald's struggle was not a single dramatic fall. It was pressure to represent a culture without turning it into a joke. Those pressures began with ancestors who learned what happens when the world closes in and you survive anyway. In Cajun, Louisiana, the founder effect was extreme. The data says this isolation elevated carriers for disorders like Tay-Sachs, Friedreich's ataxia, Usher syndrome, and a spinal muscular atrophy variant often called lazy baby disease. In some areas, Tay-Sachs carrier rates reached about 1 in 10. Here is the mini drama inside that statistic. The problem is invisible. Recessive genes don't announce themselves. People can be healthy and still carry them. The choice families make is the same one their ancestors made centuries earlier. Stay close, marry familiar faces. The consequence arrives later when two carriers have a child and the rare becomes real. Doctors in Louisiana learned this the hard way. Since 1981, Louisiana has run a genetic diseases program with universal newborn heel stick screening. Every baby gets tested for more than 60 conditions. The choice was clear. Screen everyone at birth. Catch problems before symptoms take over. The consequence has been prevention. Tay-Sachs enzyme tests in high-risk Acadian parishes have prevented affected births. In most of America, Tay-Sachs is a chapter in a book. In Cajun, Louisiana, it is a lived reason to act early. Ellen DeGeneres was already rich and famous when her body failed her for the first time. Doctors told her what millions of Americans hear every year. Something inside her was growing that should not be there. You think Ellen is a California success story. You're wrong. Her story begins in a place where sickness followed families for generations, and no one knew why. Before the talk shows, Ellen was a quiet kid in Louisiana. She grew up in Metairie outside New Orleans in a world shaped by heat, water, and industry. Her mother, Betty, came from Cajun stock, Acadian people who were pushed out of Canada in the 1700s. They arrived with almost nothing and built tight communities because they had no choice. Everyone related to everyone else. That closeness kept culture alive. It also trapped something else. When a population stays small for a long time, rare traits don't disappear. They multiply quietly. Ellen didn't know any of that as a child. What she knew was sickness. It was everywhere. Neighbors with lung problems, relatives with stomach cancers that came early. In Louisiana, illness was often treated as fate. Her ancestors faced environmental danger without language for it. They lived near the Mississippi River, an industrial spine of oil and chemicals. They breathed benzene and arsenic without seeing it. Cancer rates climbed. In some river parishes, cancer deaths doubled the national level. But in Cajun communities, another layer sat quietly underneath. Genetics. Small founding populations can amplify rare mutations. One example is Lynch syndrome, a hereditary cancer risk tied to genes like MLH1. In Cajun families, certain variants appeared more often than expected. Studies of tumors found inherited mutations that looked sporadic but were passed down silently. Ellen's humor often comes from pain. That didn't start in Hollywood. It started in a state where people learned to laugh because crying didn't change the outcome. A woman sits at a kitchen table in Louisiana with a stack of church papers so thick it looks like a small phone book. She runs her finger down a list of names. The same last names appear again and again. She is not doing this for fun. She is doing it because a baby in her family was born with a problem no one can see from the outside. She heard a word that sounded like a curse. Usher syndrome, hearing loss, vision loss. Then someone told her something that made her freeze. We can trace it. She thought genes were invisible, but in this place the past is filed and dated. In this place, a people nearly erased by deportation became one of the world's best maps for genetic research. If you skip this story, you may believe small, isolated groups are only a sad footnote. Stay, and you'll see how isolation turned into a strange kind of power. The Cajun story begins with disaster. The deportation pushed a population toward the brink. A group survived through about 3,000 to 5,000 resilient founders. Those founders moved into Louisiana bayous, where isolation was real. That isolation did not feel like a gift. It felt like a fence, but it created something no one could plan. When a population starts from a small group and stays mostly within itself, rare genetic variants can stick around. The subject here is the Cajun population itself, a famous living lab because its ancestry is both tragic and traceable. Here's what made it research gold. Those 50 to 100 related families meant many people shared long, identical by descent DNA blocks. Identical by descent means chunks of DNA passed down from the same ancestor. In large mixed populations, those chunks get broken up. In this Cajun setting, the blocks stayed long, like bright streetlights for researchers. The drama is in the records. In most populations, you cannot follow family lines cleanly for hundreds of years. In this Cajun community, church records and family records stayed strong enough that scientists could connect genetics to pedigrees. That is how an Acadian unique Usher syndrome variant could be pinned down using church records. That is how Friedreich's ataxia could be tracked back to founders. One discovery path followed Tay-Sachs. Projects mapped a Tay-Sachs cause to a hexa insertion traced back to one 18th century couple. That detail lands hard. A couple, a line, a path through time. Their choice was ordinary life. The consequence was that the variant survived, and later, researchers could locate it because the records were so strong. The Cajun community does not just sit while outsiders study it, it cooperates. That cooperation turned a people once treated as disposable into a group that helped accelerate human genome mapping. This is not a story of bad genes, it is a story of preserved signals. The ancestors were pushed into isolation as a survival move. The descendants turned that isolation into outreach, turning a closed circle into a bridge. The world once tried to scatter these families until they vanished. Instead, their ancestry became one of the clearest genetic stories on Earth, and the community turned that story into tools that keep other families from breaking. Emerald never has to explain this on camera. His success does something quieter. It tells Cajun kids their culture matters. And when a culture feels it matters, it shows up for itself. It screens babies. It faces hard facts without losing pride. So the next time you hear Cajun music or watch Emerald cook, remember the part of the story nobody puts on a menu. Cajun Louisiana didn't just survive history, it reshaped medicine, it taught doctors to expect the unexpected. And every time a chef steps into a kitchen, he carries a community that learned the hard way how close survival and risk can sit side by side.